Koresh came in late in that sense. The movement itself is a break off from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And you really have to go back to the 19th century. And there was a Baptist preacher named William Miller who, calculating through different Bible prophecies, mainly the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation. Remember, this is 1840s. He came up with this idea that the coming of Christ, the return of Christ, would be, first he had said 1843, and then he figured out that he was a year off in his math, and he said 1844, nothing to do with Adventists. They didn't even exist then. He wasn't a Adventist. Seventh-day Adventist means seventh day, keeping the Sabbath, what Christians would call the Jewish Sabbath, in other words, Saturday. And Adventist means you think that the Advent is soon coming, the Advent not being the birth of Jesus, but the second coming, as Christians call it. So it goes, the movement actually goes back to that prophecy movement of the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and even people like Joseph Smith, who began the Mormons as we know them today. He was kind of swept up in that as well. But there's one particular woman, Ellen G. White, and she's the one who actually founded and incorporated what we would call the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And that was after Miller's failure, because obviously we're sitting here talking here in 2023 and Jesus didn't return. But she came up with the idea that that actually that date was correct, but Miller had the wrong event. And she was very allegorical, which is really going to help us to understand David Koresh way down the line. So in the 1840s and 50s, when that prophecy failed, she began to teach and preach and claiming to be a prophetess herself, which Miller never claimed. He's just a Bible student, literally with his pencil and paper, adding up dates and figuring out how many days of Daniel are mentioned in this chapter in the book of Revelation. There are these periods of time, 1,260 days, 1,290 days, 1,335, and so forth. And people all through history have played with those, and many of them have thought, well, a day is a year. So if we could figure out, the years until Christ comes, then we might come up with a date. But what she said was the date was correct, but Jesus had been doing what is called atoning for the sins of the world in heaven. I guess it took a long time. In other words, he's up there in heaven, paying for all the sins in some kind of way. And he had left the sanctuary, which is the heavenly temple, and now was opening the books. So Miller's date was correct, she said. It was in October 1844. Jesus left the temple in heaven, and the books were opened, and the investigative judgment is what she called it. And what that means is, of course, she thought it wouldn't be long until the actual visible second coming. But she was very keen on saying that was not wrong. That date wasn't wrong. It's just something that happened in heaven, not on earth. And as soon as Jesus was finished with going through the lives of all the people who ever lived in history and making some sort of judgment or determination that's mentioned in the book of Revelation, it says the books were opened and the dead were judged according to what they had done, and the living were judged rather according to what they had done. So that became a period. Now, obviously, as I said, she didn't expect it to go, 200 years almost, nothing like that. She thought she would live to see the end, and her husband, James White, as well. But she did claim to be a prophetess, and she did write books that her movement then that began to be called the Seventh-day Adventist considered to be inspired writings. The reason all that's important is that David Koresh in the 1980s would refer to Sister White. That's what he called her. And all Adventists refer to her that way. And they believe that her writings are infallible, they're perfect as interpretations of the Bible. So he just as well could be quoting Isaiah or Jeremiah or the book of Daniel or the book of Revelation from the Bible, and he knew it quite well. He had much of it memorized, whole chapters memorized. But then he would say, as Sister White said, or as Sister White wrote. So he was building off of that heritage. So the Adventist church began at that point in the 19th century. But in the 1930s, there was a minister, or actually he was a lay person of the Adventist church. His name is Victor Houteff. And he decided that the interpretations of prophecy in the church, not necessarily Sister White, but as they called her, but the interpretations of certain prophetic events were incorrect. So he started something called the Davidians. And that was in the 1935. He moved to Waco, Texas. So the Mount Carmel Center that we know of so well from the fire and all the tragic events of 1993, the reason they're in Waco, Texas goes all the way back to Victor Houteff. Now, Koresh would have said that Victor Houteff was also an inspired prophet. And Houteff basically, he died in 1955, so basically 20 years was his ministry. And he would preach almost entirely to Seventh-day Adventists. And they refer to something they call present truth. And the idea would be that Ellen G. White was a prophetess of the last days, but that God's going to raise up subsequent prophets and prophetesses that will continue the revelation. And that's what Koresh began to wonder when he began to connect with the Branch Davidians. And I think it was around 1980, 81. He was looking for a living prophet. Like, he's been raised a Seventh-day Adventist. Ellen G. White has been dead since the 19th century. And so where's the living voice? Why isn't God speaking today? If he spoke to Ellen G. White, wouldn't he continue to speak since the end had not come in way over now 100 years at the time when he began to get interested in it? Well, Houteff died in 55, and it was a great shock to everybody. All of his followers, they lived in Waco on a different property. It's still there in Waco, but it was kind of more of a permanent settlement on the lake there, and it had, brick buildings and an administration building and much, much more organized and substantial than what we find in the 1990s with David Koresh with those frame buildings. And it's a different property. So when he died, his wife, Florence, sold the property and bought this new property. They call it New Mount Carmel, and that's where David Koresh ends up. And she set the date of the end 4 years after her husband's death. She had her own calculations. And she literally said, on Passover, they keep the Jewish festivals as well as the Sabbath day of 1959, which would be in the spring of 1959, Jesus is going to return. And hundreds of people came from all over the world and all over the country. I'm not sure how many. When I say hundreds, more than David had, maybe 400 or 500, 600 people might have gathered. And they're coming in cars and they're traveling in various ways. This is the 1950s. And they're camping out and they're waiting for the end of the age to come, for Jesus to return. And of course, they call it the Great Disappointment. So Miller was the one who first coined the term the Great Disappointment. He said in his diary, "We wept and cried all night, thinking Christ would come." So now in 1959, it's getting repeated. So Florence basically just gave up. She disappeared. She went to California. She no longer had faith that the movement was correct. I don't know anything about what her personal beliefs were. But there were two members of that group, Ben and Lois Roden, Roden, who took over. And they had joined in the 1950s when Hadif was still alive. And Ben actually, he died, I believe, pretty shortly after that. I didn't write down the exact day of his death, but he did add the word branch to the Davidian name. So Hadif said, "We're Davidians." And the reason they called them Davidians is they believed there would be a literal reign of Jesus Christ on the earth when he returned in Jerusalem, and there before the millennium. And all the nations would start coming up and learning the way of God, and it would be the kingdom of God set up on earth. And there would be a branch of David sitting on the throne of David, ruling and reigning. And so you get this term branch Davidian, that there's going to be this final messianic age. But remember, they're not claiming, as Vernon Howell did, also known as David Koresh, that was his birth name, Vernon Howell. They're not claiming that they are the Messiah. That was something that he claimed, that Koresh claimed it was something new. Anyway, Ben died, and then Lois, his wife, took over, and both of them claimed to have this gift of prophecy. So when David Koresh arrived in 1981, Ben was gone, he was dead. George, the son of Ben and Lois Roden, was around, and he very much wanted to succeed his father. So he resented this Vernon Howell character showing up, and he very much saw him as a rival, and we won't go into all those details, but there was a rivalry. But Lois favored Vernon, to make a long story short. She felt that, she was getting older, and Vernon Howell, later to be David Koresh, he changed his name, I believe, I'm not sure I wrote down the time that he changed his name, 1991, I did write it down. So you can see he doesn't change his name for 10 years after he's come and joined them. So he joins the Branch Davidian group of Seventh-day Adventists, a break-off group, and they believe that Christ is still coming very soon. So literally there have been this, I guess you could say, three disappointments. First of all, way back, Ellen G. White, 1844, and then not coming and not the end, and or William Miller and Ellen G. White. And then Hadif thinking that he would certainly live to see the end, and he dies. And then finally, the Rodens taking over. So when the Rodens took over and Ben died, Lois was a prophetess. She very much had prophecy. She published a magazine called Shekinah, S-H-E. She believed that one of the great revelations that she had brought was that the Holy Spirit was female, and so God the Father is one part of the Godhead, but there's also God the Mother, that's the Holy Spirit, and then Jesus, the Son of God. So it's a family with a mother, a father, and a son. Now, what Vernon began to believe, and I'll just call him David Koresh because that's the name people know, even though I'm talking about the earlier period. They began to believe that God was restoring what they call present truth. In other words, William Miller had calculated the right date for the investigative judgment. Ellen G. White had come along and restored the Sabbath day, Saturday. She had a vision of heaven, and she saw the Ark of the Covenant and heaven opened, and she saw the tablets of the Ten Commandments, and she saw a circle around the one that said, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. The seventh day, not the first day of the week, that most Christians see as a kind of a new Sabbath or a new holy day. So she restored that truth. And then when Hadif came along, he restored the idea that Christ is not going to just come and take people to heaven, but there's going to be a kingdom on earth. So that was very major to them. So suddenly they can read all of these prophecies in the Bible about Israel, even the modern state of Israel being reestablished. That was in 1948, and prophecies getting fulfilled. 1967, the Six-Day War, they got very excited because the Israelis took back the old city. And like many evangelical Christians that follow Bible prophecy, they began to get encouraged that we have to be living in the last days, because look how God is fulfilling his promises, bringing the Jews back to the land, giving them Jerusalem back as their capital, and that sort of thing. And then Ben Roden added, well, we got to keep not just the Sabbath, but the Jewish festivals. Now, this really plays into the drama with the FBI, because David Koresh would use terms like Passover. And normally you would associate that with a Jewish group, but this is a Christian group, the Branch Davidians. But they're keeping all the feasts of the Hebrew Bible, of the Lord, they call them, the Feast of the Lord. So Passover, Pentecost, the Feast of Tabernacles. Some of your listeners will have heard of some of those, because some groups today even are aware of those festivals. And so the idea would be that Ellen G. White restored the Sabbath, Hadif restored the kingdom of God on earth, Roden restored the festivals, and now David Koresh is coming. And he also is claiming to have the gift of prophecy. And he's bringing what he calls the new light, which is that he is the messenger of the book of Revelation, chapter 10. It says, when the seventh messenger, seventh is the final one, there's 7 of them, when the seventh messenger begins to blow his trumpet, which would be like putting out your message, that to him would be revealed all the mysteries of the prophets. So David found himself described in Revelation chapter 10. He began to say, okay, all this other stuff has been restored by my predecessors, but I'm restoring all the mysteries of the prophets. So what are the mysteries of the prophets? And that was his claim, to have this new light, this new message, this present truth. It was appealing mainly to Adventists, because they were already kind of acclimated to go along with this idea that there's going to be this progressive revelation and more truth will be revealed, and we can update our understanding of what's happening and what's going to happen and when things will be fulfilled. And so he began to give his interpretations of the Bible. And apparently by 1985 or so, he went to Jerusalem. By the way, he traveled with Lois a couple of times to Jerusalem. They did have a sexual relationship. So he became, her husband's dead. She's free to marry. She's the prophetess and he becomes the prophet. I think some of the members were pretty blown away by that, because they thought, well, this is really strange behavior. I mean, Lois, I don't remember her exact age, but she's an older woman in her 60s, I think, at least. And David is in his 20s. And at one point, there was even a story going around that she had become pregnant, as if it was, like a miraculous birth, because she was also past menopause. That didn't turn out to be the case, and there are different stories about that. But either way, the people we know from 1993, when you had this confrontation with the BATF and the FBI, most of them, many of them, I shouldn't say most of them, many of them went back to the older days, especially some of the leaders. For example, Clive Doyle, I know you've probably talked about him a lot, and Perry Jones and some of those members, they had known the Rodens, and some of them had even gone back further than that, and would consider themselves Branch Davidians. But then David began, by his new teaching, his new light, to attract more and more people. And he at first just claimed to be the prophet. He began to then see himself as not just the final prophet who's going to reveal all the mysteries of the end time, but he's also going to fulfill a different role that the Branch Davidians and the Adventists had never even thought of, and that is the role of a so-called sinful Messiah. And this is something entirely new. It's unique to David. And I've got my Bible here. I'm actually going to open it up and look at a couple things with you, or I can just read a couple of passages here. But in the Psalms, there's this figure that David identified as a sinful Messiah. And he would talk about this sinful Messiah, who is a Messiah for sure. So, for example, Psalm 40, there's a figure, it's a Psalm of David, King David, the ancient King David of the Bible. But what he says is, lo, I come in the roll of the book. It is written of me. I delight to do your will, O God. Your law is in my heart. And Koresh read that and he thought, well, Dave, that could have applied to David, but it has an end time application as well. And then it goes on to say, my iniquities have overtaken me till I cannot see. They're more than the hairs of my head. And he would begin to make the point to his followers, who is this Messiah? And that's not the only passage. There are quite a few others, particularly in the Psalms and in the book of Isaiah, about a prophetic figure that would come, an anointed one, that would be called Koresh, which is the word Cyrus in English, but Koresh is the Hebrew word that he used. And he would actually be a Messiah. He wouldn't be Christ. That's where the FBI and ATF had a lot of trouble. They used to say in the press conferences everything from, oh, he thinks he's God, or he claims to be Jesus Christ, which he absolutely did not claim. The Branch Davidians believe in Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, who lived 2,000 years ago. They saw him as their savior. He died for their sins. They have all the standard teachings of the Adventists about faith in Jesus. So they are a Christian group. What they've come to is the Sabbath day, the festivals, the Holy Spirit as the female side of God. And now David is adding, well, there's going to be a final figure, he called it. There's a final revelatory figure. He's also going to be the Messiah, and he's going to destroy Babylon. So anciently, Babylon, we're talking about the 6th century BC, King Nebuchadnezzar, when we talk about Babylon. And later, Cyrus, king of Persia, which would get us into the 600s. But David would read these prophecies and he would say, well, look, though, it also talks about the time of the end in those same chapters. So there has to be a final, just as Cyrus, the king of Persia, released the captives of his day and destroyed Babylon, because Cyrus did destroy the kingdom of Babylon and freed the Jews, then there'll be a new Cyrus, a final Cyrus, who will be a Messiah. And Cyrus is called a Messiah in Isaiah 45, verse 1. Thus says the Lord to Cyrus, my Messiah. But David's now saying, well, it's called type and antitype. There's a former meaning in history, but then there's a second meaning at the end time. And he began to believe that he was that one. He did claim to hear voices, to get revelations, that God would actually tell him things, such as during the siege on March the 2nd, when he had promised to come out, he heard a voice that said, wait. Just wait, one word. Don't come out. And he, of course, reported that to the FBI. They got a big kick out of that because they said, there he goes, he broke his word and so forth. But to the Davidians, when you listen to the tapes, it's as if, I wouldn't say God's speaking, but God's prophet is speaking, and God, through that prophet, has said, wait. And he was connecting it to a prophecy of the book of Revelation called the Seven Seals. And it's in the chapter 6 of the book of Revelation. I mention sometimes in interviews that the FBI, some of them thought that the seven seals were animals. But I don't know how many thought that, but I think I opened my book by saying when the FBI arrived at Waco and checked into the Hilton Hotel, they really didn't think to bring their Bibles with them. This wasn't the idea of the hostage barricade rescue team. Some real similarities and some real differences. The Adventists themselves tend to allegorize anything about the Jewish people or the people of Israel. And I'm talking about the Adventists, not the Branch Davidians. And they would tend to say that's the church. We're the new people of Israel. We're spiritual Israel. They would go with the Apostle Paul, who began to say, anybody who follows Christ is the seed of Abraham. But you're exactly right that it really begins in the 1920s and 30s with what are called dispensationalists, is the technical term. They follow a guy named John Darby from England, who is one of a group called the Plymouth Brethren. But by the time we're talking about, it really gets ramped up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s by people like Hal Lindsey. He was of this dispensationalist view. And the big difference is that the dispensationalists, the Darbyites, they often use a Bible called the Scofield Bible. It's the King James. Koresh did not use it. It wasn't his belief. He just used a straight King James. But the Scofield Bible has all these notes, and it was published in the 1920s. And if you remember hearing about this book, or maybe you're old enough to remember The Late Great Planet Earth, it was the all-time bestseller of the 1970s. It sold millions of copies. And then Tim LaHaye after that, with his books Left Behind, and then movie series. And all of those books were saying basically the same thing, that when Israel returns to the land in 1948, that's the fig tree ripening, and this generation will not pass till all these things are fulfilled. So they basically thought about like a 40-year period. So if you add 40 years to the 1948, you're into the 80s. Now, David, Koresh, and the Branch Davidians are certainly influenced by that to some degree. It's out there everywhere. But they would believe that because these Sunday-keeping churches are not keeping the Sabbath and the festivals and the dietary laws, of the Torah, they're not following the laws of God and the way of God. They are actually Babylon. So even though Hagee or somebody like that might think the end is near and be watching prophecy and interpreting all of these events in a somewhat similar way, troop movements in the Middle East and the Gulf War and all that kind of thing that was going on in the 1990s, right around this time. David was watching the Gulf War as well and was convinced by those events, but he would not think that those people had the present truth. Just that there's this general atmosphere, as you noted, that's in the air. You also had Herbert W. Armstrong, the Worldwide Church of God. His son Garner Ted Armstrong. I think they had the major radio program in the country, if not the world, also teaching and preaching that the end was near. So back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, I remember following this and hearing about it very heavily. It was all over the place. And then once 40 years passed, as always always happens, I tell my students, I teach a course in apocalypticism through the ages. And I tell them, we're going to start the study of a topic or a subject, an idea that so far has a 100% failure rate. And I know that sounds cynical, but it's actually true. Think of an enterprise that people have engaged in, put their whole livelihood in, their whole lives in, and it's always failed. And that's what you get into when you get into apocalypticism. But each subsequent movement thinks that they are right. Now, the big difference with Koresh would be none of those groups, I think Hagee included, Hal Lindsey, Tim LaHaye, they're writing books based on how they read and interpret the text of the Bible itself. Prophetic teachings, they're still all over the place today, especially on YouTube and on different kinds of television stations. Pat Robertson, the 700 Club, was very big at one point. He's always been predicting the end. But they're not saying, I am the living prophet, I'm the final messenger, I'm the one who's going to bring the final truth, and I'm gathering the remnant of God's people. And I should add that what Hadif believed, what Roden believed, both Rodens, and what Koresh believed was that God was going to choose 144,000 people scattered throughout the world, and they were going to become the true Israel. They would return to the land. They would be believing in Jesus Christ. So even though the Jews are going back to the land, Zionism is not a Christian movement. It's supported by Christians because they want to see prophecy fulfilled. But this is the idea that people like the followers of Hadaf, the Rodens, and Koresh would finally number 144,000. And this is mentioned in the book of Revelation, that before the judgment falls, God seals, and this is the same word, the idea of on the forehead, he's going to put a mark on the people that will be spared the wrath when it's poured out. So David's whole message would not be the message of Hal Lindsey, of Hagee, or any of these other prophecy types of the 70s, 80s, 90s, even into our day, because he would believe that he uniquely has the message that is going to seal these 144,000. They're called the first fruits in the book of Revelation. If you think of a harvest, and in the ancient days of the harvest at Passover, 2 weeks before Passover, you would do the wave sheaf offering. As the harvest, it's a barley harvest, and as it begins in the spring of the year, you would take some sheaves of grain and wave it in the temple before God, and that would show the acceptance of the first fruits of the harvest. And then finally, the wrath of God is poured out on the world and on Babylon and on what they call the beast power. It all connects to the 144,000 because the person who gathers the 144,000 is the figure that he claims to be, who goes to Jerusalem, a young man, and measures it. So he's found himself in the text of the book of Revelation and then these other scriptures. And what he has convinced them of is that there is this final lamb, this LAMB, this sinful lamb who's going to come and open the seven seals. And his argument was that that is not Jesus of Nazareth, that Jesus of Nazareth gives the revelation of the final lamb. So who's the final lamb? And what Steve Snyder, who was one of the seminary guys, what Livingstone Fagan, who also had an advanced degree in theology, what they would say is exactly what you ask. They would say, well, show me someone who can open the seven seals. Now, what are they? Well, in chapter 6 of Revelation, you have this figure, the Lamb, who he argued is not Jesus, and he would give all his reasons through all these scriptures, kind of like a Bible savant, I would say. Uh, I'm including the Psalms, Isaiah, many other texts that he had found that he thought referred to this figure. And he would then say, everybody opens Revelation 6 and you open the first seal, right? And it's a rider on a white horse. Well, that has to be Jesus, because in chapter 19, Jesus comes and he's the rider on the white horse. And he would then show you by opening that seal that that's not actually Jesus, that's this other figure. And it would almost be like, if not me, who? Because I'm the one who's opened these seals. And he would go through all seven of them and would apply them in this intricate way. I remember, Scott, I listened to all of the negotiating tapes. It took me 2 years, either read the transcripts or listen. And he would try to get the FBI guys into Bible studies, and they would tend to just glaze over. But, he would go, well, let's turn over to Psalm 40, and then we have Isaiah 45. Who is this figure, and so forth. But as I'm listening, I'm realizing that I'm beginning to get a glimpse of what he was weaving together. And in his own worldview that these people have begun to share, it made a kind of logical sense to them. And what they would say repeatedly is, show me someone else that can open the seven seals. Who is the figure of Psalm 40 and Isaiah 45 and so forth, who's going to destroy Babylon? And it was convincing to them on a very detailed level. What I noticed, besides listening to negotiation tapes, I did two other things. I called Phil Arnold and we did it together. We called Livingstone Fagan, who was in jail. And he was, and is today, one of the most knowledgeable about the teachings of the Branch Davidians and of David Koresh and all of his claims. So we were tutored by him over the telephone to begin to get an idea of what he taught. Then I got tapes, cassette tapes. I remember one in particular. He goes from the book of Isaiah chapter 40, verse by verse, through Isaiah 66. Okay. And if you had asked me before I listened to those tapes, I would have told you, hey, Scott, yeah, I think I know almost what's in every chapter. Name a chapter, I can probably tell you what's in it. I've studied Isaiah pretty extensively. It's used in the ancient world, and I work on those texts. But I was pretty astounded. Now, not in the sense that I was convinced by it at all, because I would take a more historical approach. What I was convinced by, or what I was impressed with, was how he could weave through them and consistently pull out this figure that he would find mentioned, and then would say, now, who is this figure? Because it can't be Jesus, because Jesus is spoken of in other passages and other times. Who is this sinful Messiah? And that's it. He didn't have the Bible memorized the way you would say, David, what's 2 Chronicles 3 verse 2? He probably wouldn't know that. I mean, I'm just being arbitrary here. That's not what I mean by memorize. What he had memorized was whole chapters of the Psalms, particularly, and the prophets, and of course the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel. Those are the main texts that he would use, and some of the other prophets like Hosea, Amos, probably all of the minor prophets, as they're called, Nahum, Habakkuk. Most people have never even read them. Well, David could quote them from memory without even looking, but then he would weave together this interpretation that was quite elaborate. And once you begin to follow it, you could see how people are being impressed with it if they come from that worldview. Even somebody like Steve Snyder, who had done graduate work in the 70 Adventist seminaries, and Livingstone Fagan. So that's more what it was. And it had to do with this, a mathematical savant can tell you what day of the week it was in July 2nd, 1846 in, 1 second. So it's not that kind of savant. But given the body of things that I'm talking about, Revelation, Daniel, all the Hebrew prophets, all the Psalms, that would be his canon, or that would be his body of expertise. Within that, he could move through that and quote this, that, and the other.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, in fact, I was impressed by it in the sense that I was trying to understand just what you're asking me. Why would they be attracted? Why would they decide that this is the one? What would make them think that? And so a lot of it had to do with finding this voice in the prophets and then saying, that's me. Like there's a psalm that says, morning by morning, he wakens me. He speaks in my ear. And then David would go to that and he would say, who is this? Who is this that God wakes up every morning and speaks to? But then he would connect it to some other text that would seem to have, in some ways, part of that same kind of idea. Well, it's a really important question. And in my book, Why Waco, the subtitle is really important because the title, Why Waco, ? Doesn't tell you a lot. In the subtitle, this is University of California, Berkeley, so high-level academic book, Cults and the Battle for Religious Freedom in America. Now, when you hear that, you could think, oh, this is a book about fighting cults and then you go, wait, but religious freedom. So you see where the title's going if you know anything about this whole issue. So the notion of cult, it's basically the N word among academics. And it's, in other words, it's pejorative, it's prejudice, it's judgmental. I think it was the day after the fire, and I'll work back to Rick Ross and all of them, but the day after the fire, April 19th, President Clinton appeared in the Rose Garden, very important kind of press conference announcement, to talk about how horribly it had been, it had ended. Janet Reno's there, everybody's there, the cabinet's there. But at one point he says in his speech or prepared statement, well, maybe this should be a warning to those who would be tempted to join cults. And I just thought to myself at that time, I was listening live, oh my God, he, wouldn't expect him to be any different, although he was a Rhodes Scholar and reads things. So does the government give us a list of approved and disapproved religions? Right. The ones that are manipulative and could be called cults, as if a conservative Catholic family, perfectly acceptable in our culture, is teaching their little kids at age 3, 4, 5, 6 about an ever-burning hell. And there are any number of things that established religions teach that we don't call cults. So the problem with cult, Tom Wolfe said, the famous novelist, a cult is a religion with no political power. And my teacher, Morton Smith at Columbia, said, in 30 years, I don't even think we've won anything in making this point because we're called cult apologists. You have to find more sociological and accurate ways of describing groups. So the Jesus movement, which is my field of study, as you know, was a cult in its own time. You got a charismatic leader who says, I'm the only guy, and if you don't follow me, the highway. And he even says, give up your father, mother, brother, sister, even says, hate them. Well, Rick Ross is a devoted Christian. He's evangelical from a background, I think. Well, he clearly went, oh, but Jesus is not a cult leader. And you go, well, why? Oh, because he was the true Messiah. See? So this is what you get into when you deal with religion. The Romans certainly thought Jesus was a cult leader, and they used the word cult in a similar pejorative way. So what we try to ask for in our academic discourse is to just say what you want. Like I wrote a book on suicide, I think I might have mentioned to you, and what we argue in the book, it's written with Arthur Droge, my co-author, a professor at the University of Toronto, and I said, we say, you commit murder, you commit adultery, you commit suicide, all of a sudden you've judged it. And we say, well, heroes in war, that's not suicide, that's heroic death. So we went to, it's called A Noble Death, Ideas of Suicide and, death by choice in antiquity. This is Greco-Romans, Masada, all these things, all the way back. And it's very similar to the cold argument. If you say somebody committed suicide, why don't you just say, he took some pills, or she took some pills, or in the ancient world, she jumped off a roof, and then you ask why. And you don't label it. So that's the problem with the word cult. So what they mean, of course, I think you and I would probably agree, a high demand group with a charismatic leader that in many ways, not brainwashes, because I think that word is problematic, but gets a group of people to align so heavily behind his or her thoughts and views and insights as being some kind of a special enlightened figure. And therefore, that high demand ends up like, yeah, you need to give your whole life and give your money and leave aside this, that, and the other. So yes, David Koresh is a quintessential example of that kind of movement. But the word cult isn't helpful. One person's cult is another person's sincerely believed religion. So what we have to do, what we're pleading for, and it's an absolutely losing battle. If you read Bro's book, which is out of print, but well worth reading, it comes across very much like David Bunz's broadcast that he's doing now, in pretty well reporting anecdotes and stories that have a ring of truth to them. Like Koresh did this and Koresh did that, and this happened and that happened. So I wouldn't put them in the category of Rick Ross, which is literally, have gun will travel, almost like a business. I got to expose these cults. And I don't know what his own personal beliefs are, but, maybe I, as a religious studies professor, having broad views of religion, might even call his views cultish. You don't have to have a charismatic leader to scare the hell literally out of people and really mess up their lives with all kinds of religious mythology and stuff like that. So I would say it's any kind of system of thought, whether it's congregationally or denominationally based or an individual leader like Koresh, that actually tries to persuade people by backing it up with eternal life and heaven and hell and so forth. And I think you've known from interviewing some of the Waco people involved, you mentioned Thibodeau and Fata, and you get this all the time in the negotiation tapes and everything you read, even the Branch Davidian video where it's in their own words, just have them talking. Part of the motivation, and it's huge, is we don't want to be lost. And David would say that, in his famous tape where it's called the Screaming Tape, where he just loses it. I don't know if you've heard it yet, but it's like a high-pitched rant for about 20 minutes. And it just sounds like a mentally ill person in a mental ward. And he's talking about Mark Bro leaving and Elizabeth and what they're doing. And he just loses it, just literally unhinged. And it's recorded. And David Bunz plays it on his channel. And it's hard to listen to. It's very uncomfortable to listen to, because it makes you think the man is a maniac, basically. But what is his power in that scream fest? you branches are going to lose it all, when I come back with my wrath and all that. So I just want to compare that to churches, for example, that would say the same thing to their kids, this sort of hellfire and brimstone thing. And young people today, thank God, I think largely throw kind of that kind of shackle off, but a lot of kids don't. My email's public and they write and say, "Dear Dr. Tabor, I'm wondering whether any of this is true, but I'm afraid I'll go to hell if I don't believe Jesus, this, that, and the other. And what do you think?" Like and I always say, look, I can't be your spiritual advisor, but I can point you to what historical studies seem to say. Philip Arnold and I have known each other for years. We both have doctorates in Christian origins. And Philip, let's see, he got his PhD from Rice University probably 5 or 6 years after I did. And we both ended up, I got mine from Chicago in the 1980s. He's a little later than that. We even had some of the same, like I wrote on Paul, he wrote on Paul, the Apostle Paul. So we have very similar interests. And we knew each other in terms of studying apocalypticism as, scholarly colleagues and so forth. Like we'd meet at conferences and over the years. Mm-hmm. So he's became one of my personal friends. Well, then when Waco broke out for us, February 28th, when the raid happened, my wife calls me to the television. I run down and start watching. She said something like, "James, come here quick. There's this crazy guy in Texas." I'm from Texas, so kind of like one of your people. There's been a gunfight and he's on the radio and he's quoting the Bible. Because David immediately called into some stations, and right away, even though he's wounded, he's like, "Well, in Isaiah 40, there's a," like that. And so that's what she was hearing over CNN, I think. And so I ran down. Well, I call Philip immediately, like probably after the shooting stopped, because I wanted to follow it. And I said, "Phil, I assume you know this. You're in Texas. What the hell was going on? Do you know this guy or whatever?" And he goes, No, I don't. But I listen, it sounds like he is some kind of guy into Bible prophecy. Well, see, that's what we work on. Mostly ancient, but we do it through the ages. Like I handle apocalyptic groups all through history down to our time. I didn't know he was connected to Ellen G. White and the Adventists. And I didn't know anything about Hadif and the Davidians and then the Branch Davidians. But I did know the Adventists really well and the Millerites that we've talked about. So he said, "Well, I'm going to jump in the car and go up there." And I said, "Well, good luck." I think he did it maybe the second day. The FBI had been called in. So he starts going to the press conferences. And he quickly realized from, I would say basically it was those daily briefings from, was it Rob Ricks? Was that his name?
Yes.
Yeah, and he was very negative. "Oh yeah, two-bit charlatan who interprets the Bible from a barrel of a gun." And then we got the March 2nd tape right away. And he sent me the transcript of it. That's when Koresh went on one of the Christian radio stations and did a 1-hour rambling thing. So he FedExed me that. I think we could have used faxes, but he had a printed copy and he just FedExed it. I remember getting the FedEx. And I read it and then I called him. And this is all within, like, by March 3rd, we got a plan. And he said, "Well, I'm going to start going up there. I'm going to, try to talk to the FBI." And he said, "Would you come down?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I'm teaching, but if you need me, I could come down and help. But why don't you just see how it's going? Talk to the FBI guys, see if they, find somebody at the press conferences." So I think he did. He was visible from the first or second day at those daily conferences. I think he got a room at the Hilton where everybody was staying, all the correspondents. And he then just began to attend, and he did talk to a few people. And I would, if you talk to him, he could tell you in detail, but he basically felt rebuffed, like John Henry and everybody and his uncle are calling in saying, "Oh, I know all about the Bible and let me interpret." And he felt like maybe he was being put in that category. And the idea, I think, of the negotiators was, we don't really need, like, we will find our experts. Like, they end up going to people at Baylor, which is fine. It's right there in Waco. But I don't think any of those people at Baylor, and they would agree, I think, were experts in, say, the book of Revelation, which we were. So time went on, and Phil then decided to go kind of independently. So he would go on Ron Engelman's show, which was a local radio station that the Davidians were listening to. And we knew they were listening because they would move their antenna saying, "Yes, I'm listening." And so Phil appeared on that quite a bit. And then we didn't know at the time, but now we know, Steve Snyder, who's Koresh's main spokesperson, started saying, "Well, we've been listening to Dr. Phil Arnold. He sounds like he knows something. Could you put him on and let David talk to him, and we'll put it on speaker? And, if he can show David where he's wrong on the seven seals, or if he has an interpretation that we will find more convincing," then Steve was kind of baiting. And he said, we would then, you would get a considerable problem with the people staying, because they would start thinking, "Well, wait a minute, this guy, Phil Arnold, he seems to know a lot too. Maybe this isn't right." Now, he clearly is just saying, "Oh God, I can't wait," because he will devastate Arnold. He will just talk circles around Arnold, which actually I don't think he would have been able to do, but he would have put up a show of his positions. Philip's very skilled and gracious in dealing with people like this, if you've seen him on any interviews. But he's a great defender of religious freedom and religious rights, and he always emphasizes this is a worshiping community. They take communion twice a day. They have prayers and Bible studies and so forth. So he wants them to be seen as a bona fide, American religious phenomenon. So the FBI didn't do that. They refused to do that. I wrote down here on March 16th, just to give you the idea of chronology, they said, "We want Dr. Arnold." So he was really the face of it. But on March the 7th, even before that, we did our, no, I'm sorry, on April the 7th, we did our broadcast together. And that was after being tutored by Livingstone Fagan in jail for hours over the phone. He was one of the spokespeople that David sent out. I think he was actually expelled for a dietary infraction, but he had a degree, a theology degree, and he still is a believing Davidian and actually has his own teaching and still believes David is coming back and all that. So he's a very well-informed guy. So we'd been tutored enough to kind of know what David thought. And then we pitched our program, not in an absolutely manipulative way, but to some degree. The whole idea of it, it's really very simple, is I talk to Philip, he talks to me, and we talk about if somebody thought this and this and this, like that they're in the fifth seal, which says, "Wait for a while till the rest are killed." That could be understandable. And yet there are other texts in the book of Revelation, which has a lot of ideas in it, particularly in chapter 10. And so I would say something to David like, and I can send you a transcript of it, it's public, if I can find it somewhere. I don't have the tape handy, I used to have it, but it's been transcribed. Something like, I'd say, Phil, from what I understand, David Koresh believes he's the seventh and last messenger mentioned in Revelation 10. And it is true that when the seventh messenger blows his trumpet, the end is near. It's all over. I mean, if you read it, anyone can read it in the Bible. Seventh messenger blows his trumpet, that's it. So he must, blowing your trumpet would be kind of getting the word out. And it does say that that messenger will be given an understanding about all the mysteries of the prophets. You see? So that was the key. So here are these Davidians thinking, okay, a guy is going to come at the end of time. And they thought they were at the end because they thought the Gulf War was the sign. And they'd read Daniel 11, which is, about the Middle East and the final events in the Middle East, king of the north, king of the south. And it fit the Gulf War pretty well. I wrote a paper on that, just trying to show people how somebody could interpret it that way. And we've had many interpretations of these things over the years, of course. So what we said was, so in the days, it says in the days of the sounding of the trumpet, like it's a period, when all the mysteries of the prophets are revealed. So see these people sitting on the edge of their seats. FBI had no idea. And they're thinking, oh my God, it's happening. We're hearing all the mysteries of the prophets. This is the seventh messenger. So fortunately, the text is always infinitely flexible. And we found that in the text, that chapter, Revelation 10, that was the key. We used the Bible. That messenger eats a little book. And when you eat a book in the Bible, this goes back to Ezekiel, it means you totally absorb a message, like you eat it. And so he would say that he's eaten the book of Revelation. He's totally absorbed it into his body. And then it says, the last verse, you must prophesy again to many nations, kings, and peoples. And so that's what we used. And what we said was, I said to Philip something like, I certainly don't have any reason to believe David is fulfilling this or not fulfilling it, but the people in there do. And if they do, doesn't their text say that he has to preach, he eats the book? So that would be him teaching them. But now he's got to go to the world and preach it to all nations. How's he going to do that? I mean, it's not happening. If he would write the book, the little book of the seals, just write it and put it out, we will take it to the top theologians of the world. And that was the hook. And it would fulfill prophecy then. See? So that was it. And let me tell you this amazing story. Dick DeGuerin started going in shortly after that.
This is Koresh's lawyer.
Yeah, sorry. And Jack Zimmerman, but Dick DeGuerin first. He's very skilled, very well-known lawyer from Houston. He's had very high-profile cases. And he got rather attached to the Davidians and met all the children. And, he was convinced that the BATF had really mishandled that initial raid and that there was a good chance of a self-defense kind of defense of any kind of charges, or a case rather. So he went in for that. So when that started happening, we had hope in that. We'd already done our program, but we thought, well, who heard it? Well, I found out later from Thibodeau that some had heard it on the radio because they were listening to Ron Engelman. This would be April 7th. But Koresh hadn't heard it. He didn't hear us. He was busy doing something else. And I don't think Steve had heard it either. Well, that's kind of a problem. We put out our big thing and the boss is not listening and the boss's main guy is not listening. And I don't know that Wayne Martin heard it. Maybe they were having a meeting of their leaders. But anyway, some of the people thought, yeah, that's Arnold again, this new guy, Tabor, it's interesting. So Bill and I are talking all through April, every day. What's going on? And he's up there all the time. He's going back and forth and staying at the Hilton Hotel. So I said to him, this is absolutely true, this story. You'll think I'm exaggerating. It's not. I can't remember the date, but it was around April
10, 11, 12, right in there, right before Passover. And they're going to shut down for Passover. And DeGuerin has made his last visit. He said, we got it. The legal stuff is done. You know, we're going to work out after Passover. He's going to come out. It's all done. And it's agreed to. And there was even some kind of document to be signed that the Davidians later sent out. But I know Texas Rangers had to handle the exit, just certain kinds of arrangements like that, who would come out first and how it would be done. So that was all worked out. So I said to Phil, if you could just talk to Dick and get somehow get across maybe this tape of the radio program to David, that could add to the legal side so that the religious side could maybe be covered as well. You know, that David could say, God has told me to come out, just like, not like I made an agreement with a very smart lawyer or something like that to protect my rights. So remember, he's David's lawyer. He's not the lawyer for all the Davidians. So I said on the phone, and it was in the evening one night, I can't tell you, I could look it up, but probably 10, 11, 12 April. I said, well, if you could just get to DeGuerin. And he goes, oh, yeah, right. DeGuerin is somewhere in Waco. We don't know where. So right as Phil hung up, these are payphones at the Hilton. You remember those payphones where you'd stand at the wall? Okay, he's in a payphone booth like that. I just said, if you could just get to DeGuerin. He hangs up the phone. And there's this woman next to him, and she drops her wallet or whatever with all these cards, you know, credit cards or driver's license, and it goes all over. So, and she's very attractive. And Phil, he said, you know, hey, you got to help this beautiful woman. So he kneels down and, here, ma'am, here's your cards. Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you. And then just to be friendly, she said, well, I guess you're a reporter and you're here for the same reason everybody else is. And he goes, no, actually, I'm a Bible scholar. What are you here for? He said, I'm interested in the message, the religious side of it. And she said, well, I'm here with my husband. And he goes, who's your husband? She says, Dick DeGuerin. And she says, so what do you do? And he said, well, mainly, I know a lot about the book of Revelation and so forth. She said, you need to talk to my husband. And he said, believe me, I would if I could. Where is he? He said, he's upstairs on the 7th floor or whatever, I don't remember the floor, but it was up hidden away from the crowd. And he said, I'd love to talk to him. She says, well, come up right now. Let's go up. I know we want to meet you because he's been saying, I don't understand what he's saying. He keeps going into the Bible and I just try to follow it. And, I can't, he's trying to teach Dick DeGuerin the 7 seals. So Philip goes up. It's about 9:00 at night. They're together till 4 a.m. He's in his hotel room talking to him. And he doesn't, at one point he said they had to go get something to eat, just take a break. So they're driving around talking. He gave him the tape. And Dick called the FBI the next morning, bleary-eyed. And he said, I've got some information I need to take back in. And they said, what? I thought you're finished. We don't have plans for that. And he said, I need to get this in before Passover. And I said, okay, you can go once more. So they let him go in. So anyway, Phil didn't call me immediately that morning. I think he was just so tired. And I'm watching CNN every day because they were really covering it. So, all day, every day, not like the networks, just covered at night. And it says, I still have the tape somewhere. It says, surprisingly, Dick DeGuerin is going back in. He says he has some new information that must get to the Davidians. And I'm like, oh my God. So I call Phil. I think I wake him up. And I said, is that like our stuff? He goes, yeah. And he tells me the whole story. So we're very excited. And then Thibodeau tells us, because he was there, David Thibodeau, survivor, that he got the tape. Dick's sitting there. David Koresh calls the whole group together in the dining hall. They're all around a table. They have a little cassette recorder. They hit play. And for 1 hour, they listen to us. And he said, David is just nodding his head and listening and listening, nodding his head. And at the end of it, he says, this is what I've been praying for. These two guys, I think, are the ones that I should be dealing with. So DeGuerin's happy with that. And he said, well, I know it's Passover, but he said, look, I will give you the word after Passover. So we felt that even from that moment, he was beginning to think, oh yeah, you must prophesy again. And these guys are going to do this, this, this. And that's where he came up with the idea. We had said he should write it. That was our idea. And we used the example of Paul in the Bible. He's put in prison and he writes two of his main letters, Ephesians and Colossians. These are like in the New Testament, very major. Any Christian knows these from prison. Like his main message, he wrote it from prison. So we thought that might appeal to him. You're like Paul, you're going to write prison epistles. So anyway, we didn't know. And that was Passover lasts 8 days. And lo and behold, the day after Passover, I've got a copy right here in my hand. He sends out this letter that I know you've seen and other people have seen. But I'll read you just a portion of it. April 14th, 1993. Now, people forget, this is addressed not to the FBI, but to Dick DeGuerin. Okay? It says, Dear Dick, April 14th. I think it was a Wednesday, maybe. As far as progress is concerned, here's where we stand. And I'm going to skip on down. He warns about an earthquake coming. And then he says, I'm presently being permitted to document in structured form the decoded message of the seven seals. Every word of that sentence is important. Permitted means he thinks God is letting him do it. Structured, meaning he's not going to ramble all over the place. He's going to actually go seal 1, seal 2. Decoded, he's going to tell you what it means. Upon the completion of this task, I will be freed of my waiting period. Notice how he phrases it. Not, I will end my waiting. I'll be freed of it, meaning God told me to wait, and I've now been told that will be lifted by God. I hope to finish this as soon as possible and to stand before man and answer any and all questions. And then he says, I've been praying so long for this opportunity to put the seals in written form. I was shown that as soon as I'm given over into the hands of men, I will just be made a spectacle of, and people will not be concerned about the truth of God, but the bizarrety of me in the flesh. Very similar to what he says on a tape around that time, like, I'm going to come out and you can do your thing with this beast, poke me, says feed me bananas or whatever, in a cage. So then he gets to the details. I will demand the first manuscript of the seals is given to you. Many scholars and religious leaders will wish to have copies. I will keep a copy. But once I see that people like Jim Tabor and Phil Arnold have a copy, I will come out. Oh yeah, that's in this, and you can do your thing with this beast. So we were so ecstatic. Oh, we were so happy. And then, we got the tapes the next few days. He's writing, and some of the FBI people are saying, well, we don't know. It's another delay tactic. We don't know if he's writing. Jamar kept saying that right up to the end. He's still living, but somebody said that he's not doing interviews anymore. Maybe just not up to it right now in terms of memory and so forth. But I talked to him at the congressional hearings in 95. I walked up to Jeff Jamar and I said, why did you not believe he was writing? He said, well, I'm still not sure. And I said, have you read the first seal that survived on the disc? Because they typed it the night before. And I said, I have the disc and, I can see the date and everything. And also he refers in the first seal that he completed to the siege and to coming out. So Absolute. He said, well, he could have written that anytime. I said, no, because there wasn't any, he absolutely wrote it. We've got good evidence that he wrote it and he was going to write the others. So at that point, the negotiating team was following that trail, and the tactical team had already decided what they were going to do. And they've been planning that actually very early on to maybe use the CS gas as one technique of getting them out and ending it.
And didn't you say in your book, James, that Jeff Jamar admitted or possibly boasted that they didn't bother telling anyone in Washington, D.C., in other words, at FBI headquarters or at the Justice Department?
Yeah, in my log, you'll see I sent you a log of detailed chronology, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th. And of course, the 19th. Very important to follow. Who met in D.C. with Janet Reno, how many meetings there were. And later, I think I told you, I talked to Janet Reno. She came to our campus and she asked to talk to me. She'd read my book. I met her. She gave us, a talk here, a speech on whatever, and did mention Waco and said that it had grieved her terribly, and she'd never be over it. And the buck stops here and all that stuff. So we talked, and she said, I'm telling you, I did not know of this plan, this letter. I wasn't shown the letter. And she said, she has said in testimony, sworn testimony, I asked them repeatedly, is there any other way? Is there any other possibility than the raid, the raid you're proposing? This is not an attack effort, as they put it. And she was told, no, and he's probably abusing children. So we really need to hurry. And that's what supposedly got to her. So she was not told. She got a briefing book. Kathy can fill you in on this, Kathy Wessinger, if you get a chance to talk to her, because I think she even maybe has seen the briefing book, but I'm almost certain that the letters were not in there. He'd sent out several letters, but this letter was not there. She didn't call Dick DeGuerin and say what was worked out. So on the day of the 19th, the tapes with Steve are very instructive, because he says on the tapes, this is on the record, what are you doing? We finished the first seal. We agreed. Remember, there was this agreement to, will you send out one? And David goes, no, it has to be the whole thing. It's a message. I don't send it out piecemeal. But then the negotiators said, no, you got to do it as a test of good faith. If you'll do one, then I think I can hold off any further action. The bosses are getting restless. They always call them the bosses. And so David said, okay, I've got the first one done. We'll type it up tonight and I'll send it out tomorrow. And tomorrow is Monday the 19th. So this is just so tragic. And so Snyder's saying, we got it typed. We stayed up all night. I think, I believe, Ruth Riddle was involved somehow, but I think Judy Snyder also might have been involved in typing it. And they said, we can send it out. And then, as you know, the phone line was cut by the tank. And Kathy Wessinger has done a lot of research on the request to reconnect it. And she's convinced that the FBI refused. Like it wasn't like, oh, we can't do it. What they say now is there was so much shooting, we couldn't risk the lives of anybody. They're in Bradley tanks. You could get behind a tank or do something. But anyway, that was the tragedy. And I'm telling you, Scott, on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Wednesday was the letter. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, until Monday morning, we just thought, this is it. He's going to write the seals. It's over. We did it. Thank God. They're going to be okay. We do know from Snyder on the tapes that he has yellow pads, but he's making notes. He's scratching out probably sloppy things like, I'll do this. Mm-hmm. Now, the other thing, and this is new, I think I told Jeff Gwynn this and he put it in his book, but I'll tell you, this is new. Big discovery of mine. With the letters on the computer disk, I found dated April 19th, 1993, same type font as the letter of the 14th. Contents of computer disk and an outline of it. So they had actually typed an outline, not of the contents, but of scriptures that they didn't have time to put in. Isn't that something? So what it says is poem Eden to Eden, introduction, John 18, 1 Peter 1, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and so forth. Chapter 1, Revelation 6. Because they were in such a hurry, he would just say, put in here Psalm 45, 1 through 11. Put in here Isaiah 33, 17.
Uh-huh.
I'm reading off the page. That also was typed the day of the letter. And I don't know how this survives, but I found it online with the letter. So that means the FBI got this with the letter. This is big. This is smoking gun stuff. So they knew not only that, I don't know they got it the day of the letter, but between the letter on the 14th and the 19th, when everything burnt up, he sent out something that had contents of the computer disk, because it doesn't make any sense unless you put the scriptures in. And so in the version I created, the one you see all the time online, the decoded message of the 7 seals, I did that in Word. That's my computer. I created that whole thing. But I had to put in the scriptures, and I'd call Ruth Riddle, who was in Canada, and would talk to her all the time about it. She looked at my transcript word for word. She gave me a few corrections, and she made sure I had every quote of the Bible exactly right. So David has to have every word right, because he argues about all these terms. So I know for sure he was writing it. Now, can I say for sure that he would have come out if he finished the first seal? First seal is the longest seal, by the way. And he finished that in, I would say, 4 days, 3 to 4 days. Then I would say we're talking about another week to 10 days at the most to get the others. I think he was ready to come out.